behalf of the Ben Franklin Fellowship, it's a great pleasure to be here and partner with Center for Immigration Studies. I must confess, I'm in both organizations. I'm proudly a member of the CIS board, and we're also working in BFF. This is a moment for us in doing this activity to reflect on the tragic shooting of two members of the National Guard last November, just a couple of blocks away from the White House. This was done by an Afghan terrorist about the problem of the mass migration of Afghans, the diaspora out of Afghanistan into the U.S. homeland. This was made possible by policies taken by the Biden administration, directed by the NSC, the State Department, Department of Homeland Security. Those policies have left our country dangerously vulnerable. We have admitted tens of thousands of Afghans into the country without proper vetting, whose identity we are unsure of, and it is in the wake of those in the room who can remember 9/11, and I was in government at that time. It's absolutely extraordinary that the lessons that we learned in that disaster of that catastrophe of 9/11, we are now throwing out the window when it comes to this particular portfolio of Afghans in the country. History will rightly lambaste the Biden administration for the disastrous evacuation from Kabul in 2021.
Because the Ben Franklin Fellowship is well on its way to becoming the Federalist Society for foreign policy practitioners. But the Center for Immigration Studies deals mainly with domestic issues, but this really highlights how immigration is one of those issues. I think somebody cleverly came up with the term intermestic, that it obviously is the intersection of foreign policy and domestic policy, and our coordination here and our cooperation highlights that.
It's an honor to be with you, and I appreciate the good work that CIS and Ben Franklin Fellowship are doing, and I appreciate them hosting this event and letting me be a part of it for just a few minutes. And so this particular event matters because national security decisions made in Washington have real-world consequences. The radical Biden administration's botched Afghanistan withdrawal created lasting vulnerabilities. And today you're going to hear from some policy experts, and I wish I could be here with you all day, but I can't. You're going to hear from policy experts on the Biden administration's handling of the Afghan evacuation and the downstream national security risk created by that operation. It's not an abstract policy debate. The decisions made during that evacuation continue to affect the safety of the American public, and Congress has an obligation to confront these facts honestly. Tens of thousands of individuals were admitted into the United States through emergency parole with incomplete or unverifiable identities. In many cases, biometric screening was waived or postponed, background checks relied on records that did not exist, and basic immigration safeguards were treated as optional. Because of the many failures of the Biden administration, the system collapsed into an unmanageable and unsafe process. When Embassy Kabul fell, we lost the on-the-ground verification that kept this program honest, including the Fraud Prevention Unit. Without those safeguards, we could not reliably authenticate documents or vet applicants. That resulted in approvals for individuals who do not qualify and pose real security risk today. That isn't compassion. Instead, it is reckless. It's a reckless breakdown in oversight that puts American safety at risk. Career officials and whistleblowers inside the federal government raised concerns in real time. They warned that vetting standards were collapsing and that fraud and infiltration risks were escalating. But the warnings were disregarded. Oversight inquiries from Congress were delayed, deflected, or ignored altogether. Rather than correcting course, the previous administration chose opacity. That choice prevented early intervention and compounded the damage. Predictably, fraud followed. We're not abandoning allies. We're importing unvetted migrants. And the only promise we were breaking was our oath to keep American citizens safe and protect our borders and our people. The security implications did not end when the evacuation planes stopped flying. DHS has since identified evacuees with terrorism-related concerns, while many others remain insufficiently reviewed. Accountability requires full disclosure of vetting waivers, clear identification of decision makers, and statutory reforms that ensure future evacuations follow enforceable security standards. Without those measures, these failures will be repeated. A secure vetting process serves two essential purposes. It protects the American people and it preserves the integrity of legitimate humanitarian protection. Public trust collapses when rules are ignored and refugees suffer when that trust is lost. Security and compassion depend on the same foundation: lawful, credible enforcement. This briefing brings forward experts, whistleblowers, and oversight professionals who understand the scope of these failures firsthand. Their testimony matters, and it should inform concrete legislative and oversight action. I wish you could shout this to the tops of this place over here, right behind us. They need to hear this, and they need to act and comply. If Congress fails to act, the consequences will not be theoretical. National security failures always begin with ignored warnings. Our responsibility is to ensure those warnings are finally addressed. I appreciate your being here, appreciate being able to take a minute or two to speak, and if I had longer, I would really rap about what I think. I've held back. Thank you very much for letting me be here today, and hope you have a great symposium today. Thank you.
I'll start by saying it is a shame that it takes a tragedy like what happened last November 26th to focus public attention on this question that directly affects our national security and public safety. So I appreciate the Ben Franklin Fellowship and the Center for Immigration Studies for hosting this discussion and inviting me to help get it started. So for the Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Program, we can see Congress borrowed the name or concept of the original Special Immigrant Visa Program. But that's where the similarities stop. The criteria are different and much looser. We're talking about 1 year of service vice 15 years of service. Also, that phrase, "on behalf of," means we're no longer talking about people who worked directly for the embassy or other U.S. agencies of the U.S. government. Instead, we've opened the door to all sorts of contractors, proxies, and others. And in addition, while the Congress was opening up the program in statute, some of the more important statutory criteria were being watered down administratively. And let me provide a couple of examples about this. So, like the regular Special Immigrant Visa Program, the Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Program requires approval from the Chief of Mission. But that Chief of Mission approval authority was delegated to a Washington-based official after our embassy closed in 2021. And obvious problems with this situation. How can somebody in Washington know whether the applicant provided faithful and valuable service when he has no first-hand acquaintance with the applicant or knowledge of the applicant's work in Afghanistan? And recall also, we're talking about contractors who might never have encountered a U.S. government official in their work. Well, in 2021, the Biden administration made a blanket determination that all Afghan special immigrant visa applicants are inherently under threat, regardless of whether their employment had ended or if they had relocated outside of Afghanistan. You can see the effect of all this. There's no need for an individual determination, and it doesn't matter whether you're even in Afghanistan anymore. In doing this, the Biden administration essentially gutted that statutory requirement. So putting all this together, you can see how any Afghan who can come up with papers saying he worked for a U.S. government contractor for a year is potentially eligible for an Afghan special immigrant visa. And given the size of the U.S. and allied war effort in Afghanistan, that's thousands of people. So who is in the pipeline right now? There's about 120,000 applications for principal applicants pending Chief of Mission approval. That is, these are applications the State Department has received and hasn't assessed yet. Another 29,000 already have Chief of Mission approval and are in various stages of visa processing. That is, they're after Chief of Mission approval, but before visa interview. And to be clear about these numbers, that's just principal applicants. It doesn't count derivative applicants like spouses and children. We won't know the total number of derivatives until the principal applicants get Chief of Mission approval and get a little later in the visa process. Assuming an average of 2 or 3 children per applicant and a spouse, the total number of individuals implicated here is 4 or 5 times higher. Now that's pretty striking when you consider that since 2001, about 400,000 Afghans have immigrated to the United States, and about 200,000 of them came since 2021 under the Biden administration when they pulled out all stops. It is possible to get a police record in Afghanistan, at least according to our official guidance. But should I rely on it? That takes us back to that question I mentioned before about the reliability of official Afghan documents. I hope the problem is clear now. This is something like going fishing with an unbaited hook in an empty pond. And then when I don't catch anything, I say that fish don't exist. Right? So while I'm musing about fishing in empty ponds, the Trump administration is acting. Immediately following the shooting, the Department of State paused all processing for Afghan special immigrant visas and paused issuance of any visa to anyone traveling on an Afghan passport. Our colleagues at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services took similar steps with the applications they control. In December, the President signed Presidential Proclamation 10098, which restricted the entry to the United States of nationals from a number of countries, including Afghanistan. As we've seen in the past, the President's directives can be challenged and modified in the courts. I'm sure advocates for more Afghan immigration in the United States are doing everything possible, both in the courts and on the Hill, to undo what the administration is doing. And that concerns me. We cannot compromise our national security or public safety for any foreign national, ally or not, especially when we cannot properly vet them. The American people must always come first. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is James Rogers. I served 6 years as a Foreign Service officer at the State Department, with tours in Namibia and Brazil, and then I spent 2 years in Washington stuck in bureaucratic limbo fighting the State Department's attempt to fire me after whistleblowing. During that time, I was briefly assigned to process the applications filed by Afghans for special immigrant visas. During that time, I saw firsthand how shoddy the department's process was for vetting Afghan applicants. So the message from the department was clear. The SIV unit was not a priority posting. It was not a place where important work was done or where high-performing officers were developed. It was a dumping ground for misfits and the temporarily displaced. Afghanistan is a high-threat environment where the Taliban had infiltrated U.S.-supported forces, where forged documents were routine. Yet the unit processing the applications had been deliberately staffed with officers from the department considered expendable or temporary. Everything in our office felt ad hoc. What I found in those files shocked me. The core eligibility requirement for an SIV is straightforward. The applicant must have performed faithful and valuable service to the U.S. government or a U.S. government contractor in Afghanistan for a specified minimum period, which we've heard a little bit about already. That employment and the credible threat resulting from it are the legal and policy foundation for the visa. You would think that the U.S. government could verify who had worked for itself, but it can't. It couldn't, at least at that time. The mechanism for verifying an Afghan's employment was remarkably insecure. The Afghan applicant himself would submit a letter of recommendation from his U.S. boss. I never saw any systemic process for independently confirming that the named American existed, that he or she had held the role claimed, or that the applicant had actually worked for that person. The department was essentially taking the applicant's word for it, supported only by a document the applicant himself had submitted. This was precisely the kind of vulnerability you would expect to see in a program designed to fail. I estimate that roughly 3/4 of the applications I handled were clearly frauds. These were glaring red flags any reasonably trained officer could spot in minutes. If I, doing only preliminary file review, could identify obvious problems in 3/4 of the cases, what does that tell you about the remaining 25%? How many of those were actually legitimate versus how many were just more sophisticated frauds? They never allowed us to interact with the officers doing the actual final adjudications. So I only saw how our end of the operation functioned. But I had experienced firsthand the State Department's culture of extremely quick visa adjudication. So I wouldn't be surprised if those applicants who didn't have obvious indicators of fraud were approved with that much scrutiny. So the natural question is, why haven't more whistleblowers come forward? My experience provides the answer. Whistleblowers get punished. The formal protections failed me. When I tried to use the proper channels, they failed completely. I submitted complaints to the Inspector General of the State Department. I submitted a complaint to the Office of Special Counsel. The Inspector General refused to investigate my complaint and instead forwarded it back to the Bureau of Consular Affairs, who were the very people I had been accusing, where it just quietly died. So the failures of Afghan SIV processing and my whistleblowing experience point to a systemic problem. A foreign affairs bureaucracy staffed with people who mostly oppose an America First foreign policy and who feel they can act with impunity, notwithstanding presidential directives to the contrary. When the cost of speaking up is your career, when oversight bodies fail to investigate, when agencies can use the grievance process as leverage to silence independent review, then silence becomes the rational choice. and silence in programs with enormous security implications is itself a threat to national security. Thank you.
Afghans who did assist U.S. forces and faced serious threats as a result should, without a doubt, be brought to safety here. I don't believe any American disputes that. The problem is, in their vast majority, those are not the Afghans who have been welcoming. Policymakers, including members of Congress who are rightly concerned about this issue, should understand that the United States is not primarily rescuing Afghan allies. Instead, it's admitting individuals with no direct connection to the US government or its contractors. Sadly, many advocates for countless Afghan admissions rely on emotional or patriotic appeals to lure the American public and lawmakers into following suit. I think it's quite naive and somewhat arrogant to assume that newcomers will automatically leave their beliefs, norms, and biases behind. So to conclude, if we're not welcoming US allies or persecuted refugees, who are we bringing here and why? And the last question I want to leave you with is how many Lakanwal, the Afghan who is accused of shooting the National Guard in DC, how many time bombs like this person are here already? But also, how many like this young man who was arrested in Quantico for prohibited sex with a minor are here also?
Numbers matter most. And I say that because, population size really is the first and foremost issue you want to look at with the impact of any immigrant group. I mean, let's be honest here, if there were only a couple hundred Afghan immigrants in the country, we would not be having this conference, all right? Because the size is just not important enough to make a big difference. But we don't have a couple hundred Afghan immigrants, we have a couple 100,000 Afghan immigrants. And you can see in figure 1 that that number has been rising very rapidly. So it doubled between 1990 and 2000, it doubled again by 2020, and then it doubled a third time just in 4 years, 2020 to 2024, coinciding roughly with the Biden surge and the evacuation from Afghanistan. So very rapid growth here. If you look at children who live in Afghan immigrant households, 43% are living in poverty compared to 13% of children who live in native households. And you see similar patterns with adults. Now you notice in the figure I also have that brown bar representing non-Afghan immigrants who came since 2010. You can see they're also struggling, okay, but not nearly as much as Afghan immigrants are. Why are Afghan immigrants experiencing such a high poverty rate? Well, if you go to table 1 on the next slide, you see that there's a bunch of different statistics there. I want to focus on that first one, working age adults without a high school diploma. You can see that about 30% of Afghan immigrants do not have a high school diploma, they're working age adults, but among natives it's just 7%. So it's very difficult to get ahead in modern America if you don't have a high school diploma. So that first statement on the top of the slide, when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. You see that 78% of Afghans agree with that statement, only 5% of Americans. There are many others here that are similar. One that stands out to me is sometimes justifiable for a man to beat his wife. Afghans are 4 times more likely to say, yes, it is. And these large gaps in how Afghans view gender relations, I think we can't ignore these kinds of attitudes when we think about the kinds of things that Naila mentioned in terms of sexual assault of minors and such as being perhaps acceptable in those cultures. So I would just wrap up real quickly by saying that a lot of these costs are unnecessary costs. We can help displaced people in the world without bringing them all here. In particular with Afghans, we try to resettle them in neighboring countries where the ethno-cultural environment is much more suitable for their views and for where they're coming from. We've run some numbers on this. It seems, based on what we know at least, that it's a lot cheaper to resettle a refugee in a nearby country with similar levels of development than it is to bring them here and have American taxpayers incur not only the economic costs that I outlined, but also these cultural costs. Thanks.
It really reminds us that foreign interventions result in immigration, whether it's colonizing the Philippines or losing the Vietnam War or anything else, that this is something foreign policy practitioners need to think about. Anytime you think about what country we're going to invade or whatever, I mean, not just that, but we need to understand that there's a variety of consequences that could stem from that. One of them is large-scale immigration of the United States. And the other thing that Nayla's presentation reminded me of is how mission creep exists in immigration. Because initially the evacuation was just the evacuation, but since the evacuation we've let in almost twice as many people as we evacuated. And likewise with the justifications. In other words, originally it was allies. Well, allies were supposed to be people going out outside the wire in body armor and risking their lives, and then it turned into people who worked in the office, and then it turned into the kitchen staff and the truck drivers, and then it turned into people who were translators for Reuters. And so, again, mission creep, but also really results in expanding any immigration program into something that it really wasn't intended to be.
The machinery of the CARE program, which was, now that we've had several years to deal with this, quite clearly a fundamentally flawed process, particularly from the perspective of the United States, in that you want to know who is coming to the country and do they meet the criteria that we've set forth to bring them here. In the case of Afghans, largely SIVs, we've talked about that. What were their services in support of the American cause, mission in Afghanistan? How was that verified? Were there any people there that kept that an honest relationship? Because when you screen an applicant to come to your country, it inevitably has to be somewhat of an adversarial process. This is what the whistleblowers have shown to us, that the CARE process was ultimately infiltrated by NGOs and others who had an interest in making sure that people were processed. That's why we hear back from people who worked inside CARE that they had to meet certain quotas, they had to find ways to process people. They inevitably became advocates for the people, the Afghans, that they were trying to bring that were trying to screen to see if they qualified to come into the country.
The Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Unit, known as ASIV, was set up in our South Central Asia Bureau to perform the function of the Chief of Mission Committee at post. However, in practice, the ASIV unit eliminated the checks and balances in the approval process. They insisted that ASIV vetting was a document-based process, meaning review of the letters of recommendation, letters of employment was the vetting process itself. The ASIV unit maintains a spreadsheet from diplomatic security of over 1,000 known or suspected authors of fraudulent letters and fictitious companies. However, using a letter from someone on the list may or may not have been flagged for fraud interviews. Even when the applicants were refused, they would get a soft 221G or pending more documents refusal and be allowed to reapply with a different employer and or letter. Verification of the letters authenticity consisted of a single email sent to the email address supplied by the letter writer, which often could be monitored by an Afghan who worked for the ASIV unit. ASIV unit leadership's motivation was to approve as many Afghans as possible, to clear out the lily pads, and not to safeguard the homeland. So the CARE office had essentially been taken over by completely unqualified and corrupt Afghan nationals who had begun to rig the hiring system to make sure their family members were hired, freezing out the qualified Afghans who had worked for the U.S. government in Afghanistan. I firmly believe that Great Hills Solutions, the contractor employing the 300-plus Afghan nationals, was aware of what was happening. As bad as all that is, I reported all my concerns to the CARE office leadership. I had every expectation that they would take my concerns seriously. What did they do? They contacted my supervisor. They accused me of having some personal bias or financial motivation. They completely failed to look into the things I have reported. For a program that cost the American people over $12 billion in 4 years, I was horrified that there was no oversight or accountability.
I have observed and documented credible action that the previous administration had released potential Taliban terrorists and supporters onto American soil, with no way to track their whereabouts, intention, and activities. Until the Taliban situation is addressed at the highest level of our government and corrective measures are implemented, we are placing our lives, ourselves, in a grave risk. The risk is dramatically increased with one odds that threats across American southern border posed by the unending flow of foreign nationals, 20% of whom are got-away people who are entered without detection and then burrow into our society. To me, this means that DHS and other relevant agencies were unleashing the most terrifying individuals onto American soil. These people with unknown backgrounds and intent, and in doing so, are putting a lot of innocent American lives at risk, as we witnessed in Washington, D.C., which cost the life of 2 American service members. Because of the irresponsible operation protocol established by the federal government and implemented during the Biden administration, I believe it is my obligation as a patriotic U.S. citizen to speak out. To those in position of influence and authority can take corrective action to protect the American people.
The OIG decided to do a massive inspection, and guess what happened? My director, Sarah Burnett, and others basically decided to flee to work on the Afghan relocation efforts. That was really rich, but not only did they do that, as a whistleblower, I felt basically, the hell broke loose. I was demeaned in front of the rest of the GEC leadership. Our front office means the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy scolded me, and as a whistleblower, I faced a lot of backlash, just like one of the colleagues who reported his whistleblowing, and I had to curtail and leave the Global Engagement Center. The influx of Afghans started in the United States, in Doha, at Camp Asaliya, Doha, which was a very good U.S. military installation. When I was a public diplomacy officer in Qatar, I believe that the operations that they were doing to vet, other concerns were really strong. And the U.S. Army-led vetting unit initially that was working in Doha did a fantastic job of doing biometric screening. They had a structured review of these Afghan nationals. They had clear chains of command. They were also synced up with the FBI and the U.S. State Department's diplomatic security folks. But once vetting was consolidated under the State Department authority, because of the National Security Council, we're talking about John Feiner and Jake Sullivan, basically who were friends with the ambassador in Qatar, Tim Davis, they decided to get Tim Davis to be the sort of dominant authority over vetting. And when that happened, things kind of went really loosey-goosey. There was intense pressure for all consular officers to issue. The FBI and the diplomatic security folks, they brought derogatory information about certain applicants that was brushed away very ferociously by the ambassador the then ambassador Tim Davis.
If you are attempting to get into the United States, you bear the sole burden. You have to answer every question that we want. The United States government doesn't bear any of that burden in that process. You bear the burden, and it doesn't shift until after you're in the United States and you're admitted to this country. Once you're inside the United States, if we want to deport you, I can give you a ground of deportation. You were parolee, you're out of parole status, you're now returned to the status of a person who doesn't have any right to enter the United States. When you apply for asylum or you apply for any other benefit, having been a trial attorney, and I have derogatory information, I then bear the burden on the part of the United States government to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that you are a danger to the national security, that you are an individual who has committed a serious non-political crime abroad, that you are an individual who is barred from receiving asylum on any ground. That's the difference. Everything that they did made this process so much more difficult. We can talk about it. We can have questions about that afterwards. But let me just give you this as a coda. We talked about Joe Kent before, National Counterterrorism Center Director. He testified on December 11th that NCTC has identified 2,000 Afghans who entered the country as part of Operation Allies Welcome and who have ties to terrorist organizations. That's 2,000 removal hearings where 2,000 trial attorneys are going to have to convince probably pretty clerical judges that individuals pose a danger to the national security. This is a self-inflicted wound. We did this to ourselves. With that, I'll yield back.
So I've gone back and reviewed dozens of cases of Afghans who turned out to be a threat to our security after they've arrived here. There's been a couple people have mentioned, Phil and Art have talked about how the lessons of 9/11 seem to have been forgotten by those who were running this SIV and parole programs. But I can tell you there's an even more recent lesson that should have been in focus for the folks. And I want to talk a little bit about that particular case. After we had 9/11, we had 9/09, which was not a successful attack, but it was a plot that was concocted by about 12 citizens of Afghanistan who had come to the United States and hatched a plot. They were recruited and trained and supervised by Al-Qaeda. This is the plot known now as the New York subway plot of 2009. The haystack is just huge now, though, as a result of the parole program and the evacuation. And so it's really going to be difficult for our counterterrorism professionals to look at, find these needles in the haystack. The other thing that is a huge problem is, as I pointed out, the difficulty in actually removing people who are found to present a threat. It takes a long time, particularly if they've been able to acquire a green card, and especially if they've been able to become U.S. citizens.
I will answer the question, Afghan vetting, can it be done? No. I think we're done here. The bottom line is, vetting it's a word that means checking people's backgrounds. You're pinging against databases. So you could go door to door and ask people. Can't do that in Afghanistan. You could check the national records of that country, the police records. And there was an old computer saying garbage in, garbage out. Well, in vetting, it's nothing in, nothing out. If you got nothing in the database, you're not going to find anything. So when you show up at the airport, they're going to run your fingerprints and your face and all the rest of it, and it's going to come up clean because you don't exist. You're a ghost in the system. This is statistics. This is not about pointing to individuals and saying this guy is bad. But if you have zero data about a given population of 400,000 people, and they tend to skew male. Men are like 95% of the prisoners in the United States and most other countries because, we commit more crime. And if they're young men commit more crime than old men, and children don't commit a lot of crime at all. You're simply rolling the dice. You're rolling the dice for terrorism, for murder, for rape, for all kinds of crimes, DWI. And we have let in, and we've gone into all kinds of detail how it happened, lots and lots of people about whom we know absolutely nothing. And so we're rolling the 20-sided Dungeons and Dragons dice. And unfortunately, it is a statistical certainty that the cases that Jessica cited and the ones that are in my report are just the tip of a very long iceberg that's going to melt over the next generation or so. I'll leave it at that.
The quote for this event would be, credibility and immigration policy can be summed up in one sentence. Those who should get in, those who should be kept out, are kept out, and those who should not be here are required to leave. In the case of Afghans that were brought to the United States following the withdrawal in 2021, that standard was not met. And we did not consistently keep out those who should have been kept out, and now we're paying the consequences.
At one point during a transcribed interview, a senior Biden administration official described Afghan relocation as, quote, building the plane while flying it. That phrase became the unofficial slogan of this investigation because it perfectly captured the administration's mindset. What began as an emergency response to a chaotic and poorly executed withdrawal quickly evolved into an open-ended, multi-billion-dollar program without a clear strategy and without defined endpoints, and most concerningly, without meaningful accountability to Congress or the American taxpayer. Based off information provided to the committee, Afghan relocation efforts under the Biden administration were costing taxpayers approximately $2.5 billion per year. And that figure is just for relocation alone. So it doesn't include the downstream costs that come with ORR, housing assistance, healthcare, or other welfare programs. So over a 10-year horizon, which is what the Biden administration's goal was, to keep this operating for 10 years, just for relocation alone would have ended up being about $25 billion just to move people, not to support the long-term resettlement. What should be done? What should be done now? I think first and foremost, the CARE program has to be suspended and should be terminated. While the Trump administration has taken meaningful steps to reduce the CARE program's footprint, CARE continues to operate through expensive contractors who drain resources. At a minimum, the State Department Office of Inspector General must complete a full examination of this program. Second, and this is nothing new, I know you've been talking about this all day, but vetting and identification standards must be strengthened before individuals are brought to the United States. I mean, we saw this with the Remain in Mexico policy. Like this, it works. Things need to be done before these individuals come to the U.S. And obviously that requires interagency coordination and accountability. And finally, the State Department must reassess its reliance on international organizations and NGOs, particularly with respect to financial oversight and personnel vetting.
Every time you see a bad immigration policy, when for the most part, they pop up on an NDAA, on a National Defense Authorization Act, or in appropriations. And the reason they do that is because bad policies with too much sunlight, it's kind of hard to pass them. You don't want to vote against funding the military. You don't want to go vote against, keeping the government open and worrying about a shutdown. And so they always get crammed in there. And so through a kind of pattern of appropriations in NDAA, we would extend the program. We'd add some more visas. We'd add some more visas and add some more visas. At one point, adding 12,000 additional visas to the temporary Afghan program while extending the date out. So in the NDAA negotiations that were happening over the winter, we heard rumors that, yet again, they were considering expanding this program. And then right in the middle of that debate, had the National Guard shooting took place. And so that was kind of the thing that finally slowed them down. And of course, the Trump administration rightfully froze the program as a result of that, and it remains frozen. For Senate staff, just a couple months ago when they asked me to come and speak about this, about what they should do, I kept it pretty simple. Said, do what the Senate does best, nothing. Let it die. Let it go away. The problem will end itself. If you meddle, you're probably going to make it worse. Let the administration do what they're doing now. The revetting thing is great. But honestly, the program just needs to go. And we honestly, in the future, it's something we've been saying for years, it's probably not the best idea for the U.S. to continue doing what it always does, which is goes into a war-torn zone, leaves, and then just gives visas to everyone that's there that could potentially agree with us. That's not a long-term solution, I don't think.
Whenever I hear people complain about how the Trump administration is enforcing the law, they're not doing anything that Congress didn't tell them to do. They're not arresting a single person that Congress didn't tell them to pick up. They're not deporting anybody that Congress didn't specifically say has to go. What we've talked about today is the executive branch under the Biden administration seizing Congress's prerogative to set limits on who comes to the United States and the terms and conditions under which they are allowed to come. It is a constitutional violation. We hear a lot, it's a constitutional violation, it's unconstitutional. Do you want to know what was unconstitutional? Everything we heard today is unconstitutional because it was done without the imprimatur of Congress. But it's probably going to be a lot different than it would have been if they hadn't seized that key power, that Congress talked about in Galvin versus Price, which brings me to the act that Grant talked about, the Lake and Riley Act. I do a lot of interviews. I talk to a lot of reporters about what's going on, about why are they arresting these people that don't have criminal convictions? Why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? And it always comes back to three words: the Lake and Riley Act. It was a game changer. Everything that we saw, that we've discussed today, is not possible or can be stopped under the Lake and Riley Act.
At the Center for Immigration Studies, we have kind of an unofficial rule of thumb that the written or unwritten final sentence of every publication should be, therefore immigration should be reduced. That is pretty clearly, seems to me, the issue here. As the unjustly infamous Enoch Powell said years ago, numbers are of the essence. Numbers are low. All of these other issues shrink. They're simply less consequential. And so in any immigration context, I just have to get my point here in. Numbers, low numbers mean when we screw up, and we'll always screw up, the screw-ups are smaller.